Mastering research documentation practices. Institutions hide their research documentation secrets. Where do the organizational policies and procedures governing the documentation of research studies reside within the institution? And what are the specific guidelines that its personnel are required to follow in order to ensure compliance with regulatory requirements and maintain operational excellence in research documentation practices? The organizational policies and procedures governing the documentation of research studies reside within the institution's research administration and compliance departments. Specifically, the policies and procedures are typically housed within the Office of Research Administration, the Institutional Review Board, IRB, and the Compliance Office. These departments are responsible for developing, implementing, and enforcing policies and procedures that ensure compliance with regulatory requirements, institutional standards, and good clinical practice, GCP, guidelines. The specific guidelines that personnel are required to follow in order to ensure compliance with regulatory requirements and maintain operational excellence in research documentation practices include: 1. Institutional Review Board, IRB, policies and procedures. The IRB is responsible for reviewing and approving research protocols to ensure they meet ethical and regulatory standards. The IRB policies and procedures outline the requirements for protocol development, submission, review, and ongoing monitoring. Researchers and study personnel must follow these guidelines to ensure that research protocols are conducted in accordance with regulatory requirements and institutional standards. 2. Research Administration Policies and Procedures. The Office of Research Administration develops and implements policies and procedures that govern the conduct of research at the institution. These policies and procedures cover various aspects of research administration, including grants management, contracts, budgets, and personnel management. Researchers and study personnel must adhere to these policies and procedures to ensure compliance with institutional standards and regulatory requirements. 3. Compliance Office Policies and Procedures. The Compliance Office is responsible for ensuring that research activities comply with institutional policies, federal regulations, and sponsor requirements. The Compliance Office policies and procedures outline the requirements for research documentation, data management, and quality control. Researchers and study personnel must follow these guidelines to ensure that research documentation practices are compliant with regulatory requirements and institutional standards. 4. Good clinical practice, GCP, guidelines. GCP guidelines provide a framework for ensuring the quality and integrity of clinical research data. The guidelines outline the principles and guidelines for conducting clinical trials, including requirements for documentation, data management, and quality control. Researchers and study personnel must adhere to GCP guidelines to ensure that research documentation practices meet international standards for clinical research. 5. Standard Operating Procedures, SOPs. SOPs are detailed, written instructions that outline the specific steps and procedures for conducting research studies. SOPs cover various aspects of research conduct, including participant recruitment, data collection, and data management. Researchers and study personnel must follow SOPs to ensure consistency and quality in research documentation practices. 6. Training and education. Researchers and study personnel must receive training and education on institutional policies, regulatory requirements, and GCP guidelines to ensure that they understand the requirements for research documentation practices. Ongoing training and education are essential to maintain operational excellence in research documentation practices. 7. Quality control and quality assurance. Quality control and quality assurance processes are essential to ensuring the quality and integrity of research data. Researchers and study personnel must implement quality control measures to detect and correct errors, and quality assurance processes to evaluate the quality of research data. 8. Documentation and record-keeping. Researchers and study personnel must maintain accurate, complete, and up-to-date documentation of research activities, including participant data, consent forms, and study-related records. Documentation and record-keeping practices must comply with institutional policies, regulatory requirements, and GCP guidelines. 9. Audits and monitoring. The institution must conduct regular audits and monitoring to ensure compliance with institutional policies, regulatory requirements, and GCP guidelines. Researchers and study personnel must cooperate with audits and monitoring activities to ensure that research documentation practices meet the required standards. 10. Corrective action and preventive action. CAPA processes are essential to addressing deviations from institutional policies, regulatory requirements, and GCP guidelines. Researchers and study personnel must implement corrective actions to address deviations and prevent future occurrences. In conclusion, the organizational policies and procedures governing the documentation of research studies reside within the institution's research administration and compliance departments. The specific guidelines that personnel are required to follow include IRB policies and procedures, research administration policies and procedures, compliance office policies and procedures, GCP guidelines, SOPs, training and education, quality control and quality assurance, documentation and record keeping, audits and monitoring, and CAPA. By following these guidelines, researchers and study personnel can ensure compliance with regulatory requirements and maintain operational excellence in research documentation practices. As I delved into the world of research documentation practices, I was struck by the sheer complexity of the task at hand. Ensuring operational excellence in this critical aspect of research requires a deep understanding of the intricate web of policies, procedures, and guidelines that govern the process. At its core, research documentation is about maintaining accuracy, completeness, and transparency in the recording of research studies. It's about ensuring that every detail, every observation, and every finding is meticulously captured and preserved for posterity. But, as I soon discovered, this seemingly straightforward task is fraught with challenges. One of the primary hurdles is the lack of clarity around organizational policies and procedures. In many institutions, these guidelines are scattered across various departments, with some buried deep in dusty filing cabinets, while others are scattered across digital repositories. This lack of centralization creates confusion among personnel, leading to inconsistent documentation practices that can compromise the integrity of research studies. To address this issue, I recommend that institutions establish a centralized documentation hub, where all policies, procedures, and guidelines are consolidated and easily accessible to personnel. This hub should be regularly updated to reflect changes in regulatory requirements, ensuring that personnel are always aware of the latest compliance mandates. In my experience, another critical aspect of operational excellence in research documentation is the role of training and education. Many personnel may not have the necessary skills or knowledge to navigate the complexities of research documentation. This can lead to errors, omissions, and inconsistencies in documentation, which can have far-reaching consequences. To address this gap, institutions should invest in comprehensive training programs that equip personnel with the necessary skills and knowledge to document research studies accurately and efficiently. These programs should be tailored to the specific needs of each department, with regular refreshers and updates to ensure that personnel stay abreast of changing regulatory requirements and best practices. As I explored the world of research documentation, I was struck by the importance of social nuance in the process. Effective documentation practices require not only technical expertise, but also a deep understanding of the social dynamics at play. For instance, certain research studies may involve sensitive or confidential information, requiring personnel to exercise discretion and tact in their documentation practices. To navigate these complexities, institutions should foster a culture of collaboration and open communication, where personnel feel empowered to seek guidance and support when needed. This can be achieved through regular team meetings, anonymous feedback mechanisms, and recognition programs that reward personnel for their contributions to operational excellence in research documentation. Throughout this journey, I was reminded of the critical importance of leadership in driving operational excellence in research documentation. Leaders must set the tone for excellence, providing the necessary resources, support, and guidance to personnel. They must also lead by example, demonstrating their commitment to accuracy, completeness, and transparency in research documentation. In one institution I worked with, the leadership team recognized the importance of research documentation in maintaining the institution's reputation and credibility. They invested in a comprehensive documentation overhaul, which included the creation of a centralized documentation hub, training programs, and a culture of collaboration and open communication. The results were nothing short of remarkable, with a significant reduction in documentation errors and a corresponding increase in research output. As I conclude this case study, I am reminded of the power of operational excellence in research documentation. By streamlining policies and procedures, investing in training and education, fostering a culture of collaboration, and providing leadership, institutions can ensure that their research documentation practices are accurate, complete, and transparent. In doing so, they can safeguard the integrity of their research studies, maintain compliance with regulatory requirements, and ultimately, contribute to the advancement of knowledge and innovation.